Real stories of werewolves, of dogmen from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories. Halloween season is here, so join with us in celebrating some of our favorite vintage Dogman Halloween stories from the early days of this channel, and it all begins right now.
Halloween, Holidaysburg, Hound. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I grew up near Holidaysburg, Pennsylvania. When I was a teenager, I had a group of friends who would hang out together in that area. On some days, we would get some more guys and play a baseball or softball game depending on what kind of equipment we had available. I remember more than one time when we started with a baseball, lost it, and continued with a softball. We didn't care, it was for fun. Our favorite field to play on was the large one behind the elementary school over there. I think it actually might have belonged to the high school or something, I don't know. There were 4 or 5 baseball fields in the area, and this was the second largest one. We loved it because the outfield wall was essentially the tree line of the forest, so it had a kind of Field of Dreams vibe to it. I know that was a cornfield or wheat or whatever, and we had a forest, but it was that same sense of natural awe and mystery in both cases, as though nature had collaborated in the creation of the field, making it more of a sacred act to play a game there than just a mere pastime. Looking back on it, I don't think we were supposed to be playing on any of those fields. I think they were all private property belonging to the schools that had all been built next to each other over there. Since there were never more than 12 or 14 of us max, and since we would play at times when the fields were unoccupied, nobody ever interfered with our unofficial impromptu baseball games. After each epic matchup, my core group of guys, there were between 5 and 7 of us depending on the day, would go hang out in the woods past the outfield for a while before it got too dark, then we'd each head on home. It was getting to be Halloween time this one year, which meant a lot to me personally. I was born about a half hour after Halloween, just missing it and greeting the world on All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day, November 1st, instead. It was also an exciting time of year for my friends because we were such big baseball fans. We loved the playoffs and the World Series, and a lot of the time, we would play as though we were one playoff team against another. So that meant we would go up to the plate imitating the batting stances of the particular hitters as we had seen them hit on TV. And when possible, we would even try to copy the deliveries of the famous pitchers on either team. It was a lot like playing MLB The Show now, except we would actually be out there playing the games. The fields were less occupied in October, but it wasn't winter yet, so that was probably when we played the majority of our games each year. Okay, I know you're waiting for the Dogman part, but I needed to explain the scenario and why I was hanging out in the woods at dusk with a bunch of other guys. It wasn't anything weird, and we weren't worshipping Moloch or anything like that. We were just hanging out and being teenagers for a little while longer before heading home to be ordered around by our parents who wished we would either go back to acting like kids or just move out. It was our last bit of freedom for the day. I don't remember a lot of specifics about that time in my life, but I remember that we were trying to scare each other that night in the woods. It was close to Halloween, like I mentioned before, and we were trying to tell the scariest stories we could remember. I told the chicken heart story. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. The chicken heart that grew so large, it crushed everything near it. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. The chicken heart that grew so immense that it flattened an entire city, so vast that it had its own gravity and drew a helicopter down to crash into it. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. I didn't succeed in scaring the others, but then they each took their turns and they sure as heck scared me. One of them told a story about a hook-handed killer who stalked the Lover's Lane, located just on the other side of these very woods. I didn't know there was a Lover's Lane around there yet, as I had not had a serious girlfriend, and I didn't have my driver's license yet. In fact, I don't even know now if there was one there. All I know is that my friend insisted there was. He made me believe it, and he made us all believe that a hook-handed killer liked to lurk in these very woods. That completely freaked me out, and when we thought we heard someone moving through the trees in the growing darkness, our first thought was not that it might be a deer. Our first thought was that it must be the hook-handed killer. We began backing out of the woods toward the outfield, watching behind us, as it sounded as though whatever was out there was approaching us quickly. It was just as I was at the edge of the wood line, standing at the border between the outfield and the forest, looking back at my friends coming up behind me, that I first saw the monster. I noticed its eyes as they glowed in the dark which was hiding the rest of it. I thought it was a big cat at first, as illogical as that would be to find in that part of the world. It was because it appeared to be 4 or 5 feet tall, and it had eye shine. The thing is, those eyes then rose up in height to prove that whoever they belonged to was taller than any of us. I screamed at the sight of that, even before I had made out the full silhouette of the creature. Then my friends screamed too, some of them because they looked back and saw what I was seeing, the rest because our screaming had alarmed them. We broke out into full runs, racing back onto the playing field and out of the woods. The field was not lit up, but there was a lot more ambient light out there than existed under the tree canopy. When I reached second base, I turned around to see if my friends were all out of the woods and if the incredibly tall big cat was still following us as well. Well, my friends all made it out. I did a head count. I could finally see what was chasing us, but it was not a cat as I had expected. Standing there, upright and bipedal between 2 trees at the edge of the forest, was an over 6 foot tall, dog-headed caveman sort of a guy. He was dark gray or black, which explained why I only saw his eyes back in the woods. He was clearly taller than any of us, and I think we were all an inch or 2 under 6 feet at that point. I'm not good at judging height, but this was a tall fellow. His ears stood up on top of his head, almost like the ears on Batman's cowl. He had a massive, human chest and long, ape-like arms, but I did not see clearly what its paws or feet looked like. Maybe grass blocked my view, or maybe I just didn't make mental notes about those parts of what I was seeing. I was mainly trying to figure out if we were in the clear yet, or if it was going to continue to chase us. I think it was still considering its options as I got my one view of it. The dogman, or whatever it was, stepped backward into the woods, but I knew it was still watching us as we continued to get on out of there. After we had gotten a few blocks away under the streetlights in front of private homes, walking down streets we had grown familiar with, one of us asked if the others of us had just done that as a Halloween prank. It's funny that none of us thought of that as it was happening, but only some minutes afterward. Nobody was willing to take credit for having scared the living daylights out of the rest of us. So I am still, many years later, of the belief that what we saw was some kind of a real something. It couldn't have been a man in a costume, or at least it seems incredibly unlikely. Humans don't produce eye shine, so he would have had to be wearing contacts maybe, or a mask which gave off the illusion of eye shine. Then he would have had to navigate in a pitch black forest as fast as a bunch of fairly athletic young men while wearing the contacts or dogman mask. At some point, even Occam's razor says it's more likely to have been a real animal of some sort. Could it have been a bear? It didn't look to me like one, and it was able to move quicker than any upright walking bear I've ever seen. Could it have been a bear with mange? Sometimes they can look very dog-like. Bears with mange are sick, and they're usually losing their fur, revealing lighter colored skin underneath. This creature was dark all over, and its ears were pointed, not round like a bear's ears. The other thing was, my friends and I were all completely freaked out by this thing. I mean, it scared the bejeebus out of us. Would a bear have frightened us that much? Maybe, I guess, after hearing scary stories. The next day, the guys started acting like the whole thing was just a Halloween prank. I guess it felt less scary that way. We never spoke about it all that much after that, and when we did, we called it, that Halloween prank somebody pulled on us, or the werewolf prank, and things like that. Like I said before, nobody ever took credit for this epic prank, and we had no proof it wasn't real, but we also had never heard of Dogman at that time, and we knew werewolves couldn't be real, so it had to have been a prank as far as we were concerned back in the days following our sighting of the Halloween Hollidaysburg Hound. I'm Henry Lee Dogman, and I'm here to say we couldn't do this show without the fans who pay. Today's executive producer is Godzilla Tim. I'm sure that you've all heard of him. When he leaves a comment, it's a thriller, because he's Timothy Godzilla. Please join us in thanking Godzilla Tim Walker for making today's episode possible. If you'd like to be a VIP and keep our show alive like Godzilla Tim, just join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or by clicking the join link below. You'll gain access to our brand new Sunday night episodes in which we tell secret uncensored stories that we could never tell on this channel. Dr. Death will be back at the end of this show to tell you more about that. But first, I'd like to tell you a story about a New Jersey cryptid, and we call this next one the Dixontown Road Dogfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this story happened back in the 80s when I had a job helping to deliver fax machines and printers to places in the New York area. A couple of times we got lost out where that Jersey Devil is supposed to live. We never saw him, but it actually was a weird vibe, and both times you really kind of expected to see him. To me, the Pine Barrens and areas in Vineland, New Jersey feel like Halloween, even when you drive through them in July. The only actual cryptid I've ever seen, though, was this inexplicable dog-like Bigfoot sort of thing we almost ran into while driving on Dixontown Road in Medford, New Jersey. Looking back on it, I'd say that it was probably what we would nowadays call a dogman. The situation with that job was that I would ride shotgun with this guy we can call Sam who would drive. The printing machines back then could sometimes be very large, and I did my share of the heavy lifting. Offices would use things as big as a Xerox machine as compared to modern printers. I was good enough at carrying things, but I wasn't very good at any other aspect of the job. I was young and I didn't take any of it seriously. I knew it wasn't going to be my career, whereas this was a serious gig for the driver. My partner Sam was good at finding things on Long Island or upstate New York, but in New Jersey, he'd mainly rely on my map reading abilities, which were horrible. Over there around Medford or Medford Lakes in New Jersey, they've got a lot of little tiny neighborhoods on little curvy suburban streets, like out of that movie Poltergeist. I don't know if they were also built over native burial grounds by the Pathmark Man, but to us, each of them looked the same as the previous one. Between the similarity of their design and me associating them with that horror movie, we would both get confused when delivering around there. Most of the time we were delivering to offices and stores which were easier to find. You could stop and ask someone where a store was, and they would usually know. You can't do the same when delivering to people's homes in these identically unique little suburban enclaves. This was one of those times when we had to locate a number of private residences, and it was a long and hard day. We finally delivered the last machine as the sun was beginning to set. Heading off in the growing darkness onto Dixontown Road, our intent was to jump on some highway heading back up north to New York City. I don't remember how we were planning to do it, but we always tried to avoid toll roads, so I know we still had a lot of driving ahead of us. Now, Sam was a pretty straight arrow kind of a guy. He had one slight vice, which was that he would sometimes, after a long day, pull the van over onto the side of a highway, standing outside alone, and smoke a cigarette. He made it clear early on that this was his private time, and I wasn't to say a word to him until it was over. I think he was annoyed with my bad map reading on that particular day, but rather than have an argument about it, he would just go have his smoke, breathe the air, look at the trees, calm down, and then drive both of us home. Sometimes things don't work out as planned, however, and as I sat in the driver's seat, tapping the dashboard in time with music on the radio, Sam suddenly came flying back into the van, slamming the door behind him. He looked pale, and Sam had a deep suntan. He looked kind of sick, actually, so I was confused why he would jump in the driver's seat if he was about to be ill. He told me to roll up my window, and I was confused. He revved the engine while shouting at me to turn off the radio. I hit the button, killing the sound, and Sam got the motor going and put the van into drive. I had forgotten that he had told me to roll up my window, and then, before Sam could get us moving, a thick, hairy, long arm reached into the window to my right, passing in front of my face, grabbing at Sam to my left. It was under my nose, and I smelled this arm. I accidentally tasted the hair on this arm. I'm sure you'll believe me when I tell you that it was nasty. Maybe that was what caused the owner of the arm to pull it back out of the window. I do not know. The important thing is that when the arm was back outside, Sam hit the gas before it could reach back in. He screamed at me using foul language that he had told me to roll up my window. I heard what he was saying, but I still had no idea whose arm I had just smelled and tasted. So, rather than rolling the window up, I leaned my head out, looking back behind us, and that was the moment when I saw a running, bipedal, dog-headed man chasing us. He was bipedal for a few seconds anyway, and then he dropped to all fours and seemed to really pick up the pace. That was all I wanted to see. I pulled myself back in, rolled that window up, and informed Sam that it looked like the thing could run 50 or 60 miles an hour. Sam looked like he was about to shout at me more, but then I saw his eyes doing the math based on what I just told him, and he shut up and focused on getting us the hell out of there. I never looked in the rear view, and that van had one on the passenger side. I didn't want to see it again. I didn't want to know if we were outpacing it. I just trusted Sam's survival instincts, and I stared out ahead of us. I could tell by Sam's posture and behavior when we were finally safe. Sometimes I wish I had monitored the creature's progress behind us, as it would make for a better and more detailed story to tell. The truth is, I was too scared to look out at it. Sometimes people say they experienced an unnatural sense of fear when they encountered a dogman. Having the arm of a big, hairy monster shoved in my face seems like something that it should be quite natural to have a great fear of. I'm not proud of myself, but I was very stunned by the experience when it happened. I was not prepared for anything like that to happen. I didn't even know that sort of thing could happen. The only hairy monster I knew about back then was Bigfoot, and they were only supposed to be in Washington State and Canada. That's what they used to say on TV back then anyway. They also used to say that Bigfoot was shy and afraid of mankind. I had never heard of a dogman, and neither had Sam. We actually gave it our own name that we made up on the spot, Dogfoot. It was like a Bigfoot, but with a dog's head. People sometimes ask me if the creature had feet like a Bigfoot or like a dog, and I really didn't make note of that at the time. I know that the front arm seemed like the arm of a human, mixed with a chimp or gorilla when it was under my nose. When I saw it drop to all fours and run, though, it looked like a giant dog or a wolf to me. I guess that must be the answer to the question about the size of the feet. They must have been like dog legs for it to have run that way. Unless, and this is something I've only read about in a few cases, could it be possible that it had human or Sasquatch type feet when it was bipedal, but morphed into dog's limbs when it needed to run faster? I mean, if it were a werewolf we saw out there in New Jersey, then it could be a shapeshifter. Would it be that much harder to believe that a shapeshifter could have a few different Dogman-shaped models he or she could shift into? My sighting was so brief and was so bizarre that I can't rule the shape-shifting ideas out. That having been said, I do not recall actually seeing anything change when the monster dropped to all fours to chase us. When it did that, I felt really unhappy inside. I felt like we might be about to meet our maker, and I didn't know if we would make it back to New York City. I was sad. I was scared. And so it was not my best moment. Having those strange things happen on that night in the way they did changed me. I know people say things like that casually. Oh, that movie changed me. Oh, that reggaeton rap changed me. But having a dogman's arm in my face, then wondering if it could outrun our van, that really scared me. It changed every moment of my life afterward. I'm concerned each time I turn a corner that a giant monster might be on the other side. I have a paranoia about opening doors. In my home, I have a video system set up with monitors outside each door. This way I can look inside the room on video before opening the door. Laugh if you will, but I've never accidentally walked in on a dogman, and I credit my video system with that. Seriously though, I've been in therapy ever since then, and that's because I've got serious issues about what might be lurking in my blind spot. What's behind me? I look behind myself so often I sometimes resemble a schizophrenic, and I don't mean that in a rude way, I mean it in a literal way. I like to sit in front of mirrors so that I can see what's behind me without looking over my shoulder. Nobody has patience with this quirk about me, and I can't say I blame them. I can't say I blame myself either, though, because I'm the only man in history who can claim he tasted the Dixontown Road dogfoot when Batman was really a dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, the scariest thing that ever happened to me didn't really scare me at the time it happened. Well, not till the end anyway, and I'd better start this from the beginning. I don't remember how old I was, but we still lived at our original house at the time. Our youngest sister had not yet been born, so I was still very young then, but not so young that what I did wasn't very stupid. I was old enough to know better, but I made an error in judgment due to my excitement over the Halloween holiday and my love of fantasy stories and superheroes. In fact, that was the night when my interest shifted to monsters, as in cryptids. That was the night when I saw an actual monster. I should have warned you before I said that. That was a spoiler. I didn't at first understand that this is what I was seeing, and none of the others even noticed that there was anything there at all at first. I haven't spoken to any of the kids I was with that night for over 20 years, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you where this happened. It was a small town called Luther, Michigan. One of my friends back then used to say the story happened right at the edge of town, on Birch Street by the forest. Actually, it was a block or two further into the town where the action started, to be honest. To me, that's even scarier, that what was stalking us was inside the town, not in the woods nearby. We were actually over in the churchy part of town, where you've got both the Methodist and the Baptist churches located. We were, I think, still on State Street, turning left onto Elm Street, when I first noticed that there was something there. It was ahead of us at first, on our right. I didn't say anything to the others because I wasn't sure what I was seeing, and I didn't want to get made fun of if it turned out to be a cat or a dog or something. But when we got to that block that had the trees on it, I could see the thing hiding behind one of them. Now, don't get me wrong, this was not a block with 100 trees. It was not a forest, it was not a grove. I mean, it had a few trees on it, like 3 or 5, something like that. And there was something the size of a big man hiding behind one of those random trees. It looked like it was sneaking peeks out at us, and I tried to pretend I hadn't noticed. Eventually, I was able to time a glance over there at the same time he, she, or it peeked out, and what I saw, in my young mind, I interpreted as a sighting of the Batman. You know, from the movies and animations and comic books, he had white-colored or very light-colored glowing eyes, just like in the TV cartoons. They glowed so brightly that it was hard to make out details of the face around those eyes. I could see that the figure stood bipedally like a man and that it had a muscular physique. It also had tall, pointed ears, and so, to me, all of that visual information added up to the Batman. Now, I was too old to think it was the real Batman. At least I think I was. I did go get Spider-Man's autograph when one of his action figures came out around that time. How old was I then? I mean, I probably thought it was a cool Batman costume that I wanted to see better. It didn't look like the kind of cosplay we had back then. It looked more like something from the movies. Maybe if it happened more recently, I might have thought cosplay. But the costumes people wore back then were mostly not half as sophisticated as modern ones. I didn't alert the others about what I was seeing, as I half wondered if it might be a certain practical joker that we all knew. He had declined to come trick-or-treating with us, claiming that he had a cold. I was wondering if he was pranking us and that he might end up revealing himself to be the Batman. The thing was, as I said, I didn't think he could pull off a Batman costume with actual glowing eyes, and he certainly wasn't as tall as this figure. We had already agreed to walk all the way down Elm Street in tribute to Freddy Krueger and as a dare to each other. We didn't really expect much candy from over there, so we reached the area where Elm Street ends as a little dirt path, and out comes this big hairy thing, charging at us and barking like a junkyard dog. It had glowing eyes, and I think it was what I had seen earlier, or else another creature just like it. It stood like a man, but had tall, pointed, hairy ears and those glowing, demonic-looking eyes from hell. This had to be what I thought was Batman earlier. It looked much larger once it had bounced out into the light. We tore back towards State Street, screaming our heads off. A car turned onto Elm Street ahead of us, and we flagged it down. I think we were going to ask if we could get in, but when we turned around, the Dogman wasn't even there any longer. The car or its headlights must have scared the thing off. We apologized for stopping the car, explaining that we thought we were being stalked, but it seemed to be over. The lady inside the car was nice, and she insisted she drive us all home. We accepted a ride to another part of town, which we knew was candy rich, and on our Halloween adventures continued. It's funny when I think back on it. If I had come that close to being snagged by a real Dogman these days, I don't think my next thought would be about getting myself some more candy. But back then, we just rolled with the punches and kept going. It was just another cool thing that happened to us. We got a ton of candy, and oh yeah, we almost got eaten by a werewolf. Now that's a good Halloween night. These days, I've forgotten almost my entire childhood, but I remember those few minutes like they were still happening. That brief period of time when Batman was really a dogman. I could hear the Dogman in the night. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story about a Dogman experience I had. It started as a sighting, but lasted long after I couldn't see the creature any longer. This was the worst night of my life so far. I got out of it alive, so I shouldn't complain, but it was an unforgettable experience that taught me that the world isn't as nice and simple as we like to pretend it is. I was staying in a cabin in upstate New York because my wife and I needed some alone time. We had been married 3 years and were going through issues. This was about 9 years ago now, and we're still married, so I guess it was a good idea to take a break when we did. We've done it other times since then. Sometimes she goes away for a while, and sometimes I do. This first time, I was, as I said, upstate. It had been restful and uneventful up there until my last night. That was the night when everything got completely crazy. I had decided to go to bed early in order to make sure I got up early enough to catch my 9 a.m. bus back to the city. That's right, I was off in the woods with no car. I felt safe, though, because I was in an official campgrounds, which was about half full. I think they were coming up on the end of their season as it was Halloween time and getting chilly out. Upstate New York is beautiful year-round, but especially when the tree leaves are turning colors. The cabin had a bed with no mattress. I had spread my sleeping bag on it and had been sleeping there. The window next to the bed had a lovely view of the woods, where you could see leaves colored green, yellow, orange, red, and brown. I watched the sun begin to go down outside the window as I ate something for dinner. Then I crashed out before the sun was even fully down. Waking suddenly in the night, I was disoriented as I opened my eyes and saw the most horrific thing I had ever seen, staring in at me through that window. I saw the fangs and the drool first. The thing seemed to be all mouth at first glance. Its breath was fogging up my window around its nose and mouth, but it was clearly some kind of dog or wolf or a coyote kind of a thing. Its fur coloring was dark but patterned. What I mean is, it was not a solid color, but I don't really remember details about its mainly dark coloring. It had angry, glowing eyes and ears that stood up on top of its head. I sat up quickly and retreated off the bed, getting my legs tangled in my sleeping bag and tripping backward, landing on the floor. By the time I managed to get myself up off the ground and take a second look, I saw that the animal was retreating. I could see from behind that it was a very large but otherwise very ordinary-looking dog, but it was doing a most extraordinary thing. It was tippy-toeing away on its back legs, its front arms held in front of it, dangling in the air. It looked unnatural. It seemed as though it should tip over forward, but it didn't. It seemed almost supernatural. It practically floated across the landscape, its legs pumping furiously underneath it. The entire thing seemed wrong. It shouldn't exist. It shouldn't be able to move like that. A big giant old dog running away on its hind legs, tippy-toeing that way? That just doesn't make sense. That wasn't something that God could have intended to happen. At least not the God of goodness. The curtains on my window were apparently just there for show, and I couldn't loosen them to cover the glass. I hung some of my shirts over it instead, so that I wouldn't have to see that thing staring in at me again. Once I had, and I tried to get back to sleep, I found that my heart was still beating hard, as though the monster were still there. And then, after a while, I heard the creature coming back. At least, I thought that's what it was. I told myself it was just one of the other people in the campgrounds. I reminded myself that people had to get out and walk to the public bathrooms there. They had reason to be out walking in the night. I had nothing to be afraid of. As I lie there in the absolute pitch black of that room, I felt as though I were floating out in the furthest reaches of space. In the city, it's not possible to make it this dark. There's always some ambient light coming in from somewhere. Out in the country, though, if you hang some shirts over your window, you may as well have your eyes shut because you're not going to see anything. I listened as I heard someone, or something, approaching from outside. It's someone on their way to the restroom, I told myself over and over. Then that someone walked right up to my window and began tapping on it. I made myself small, as though I could be seen in the darkness. I shrunk down inside my sleeping bag, and I hid under my cover in the pitch blackness, listening as someone tapped on my window. I waited for it to go away, but I didn't hear anything moving outside. I decided that it must have gone, and I began to try to relax. That was when it tapped again, signaling that it knew I was still in there. It knew I had not left, and it knew I could still hear it. Well, that was how my night went. Each time I was about to fall asleep, I heard the tapping again, and I knew I still was in deep danger. Eventually, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion, and then I woke up to a loud banging. I screamed in horror and rose out of my sleeping bag to see sunlight streaming in through the sides of my window, still covered in my shirts. The noise wasn't coming from my window. It was coming from the door. Another loud knocking from there was followed by the voice of the campground's manager, warning me that my bus was going to be leaving shortly. I had almost overslept because I could hear the Dogman. In the night, the werewolf with the sweet tooth. Dear Scary Stories NYC. In the mid-Atlantic town that my family still lives in, there exists an old mansion. Recently, the family that owned it sold it, and it's in the process of being renovated. People talk locally about it being haunted, but when I was a kid, it had a different reputation altogether. Back then, we thought that a werewolf lived there. Even if nothing strange had ever gone on in that big old mansion, people would have spread rumors about it just because of its appearance. It looked a lot like the Addams family home, except it stood atop this hill in the center of town, looking down on all of us in the valley that surrounded it in all directions. It was the only thing on that hill, and none of us back then had any idea who lived there. They seemed to only leave the place at night, and I had heard that the windows on their old Chrysler were tinted so that nobody could see inside. I apologize that they didn't drive a hearse. I know Chryslers aren't really the scariest of 20th century vehicles. So not even our parents knew who lived there, and how can you explain something like that? We explained it by spreading the rumor that a werewolf lived up there, and that he wanted his privacy. Since he never preyed on us or our pets, we were sort of proud to have a werewolf living in the center of town. It seemed kind of swanky, you know? But none of us had the nerve to go up there on the hill and see for ourselves because of the legend of Bob O'Reilly. Bob was a friend of my father's. He actually existed, although he's passed on since then. According to my father, and the other parents as well, Bob took a chance and went up the hill on Halloween one year. He wanted to trick-or-treat the old mansion just to see what would happen and who would answer the door. Even back then, the werewolf legend already existed in our town, but Bob was a cynic and a skeptic, and he didn't believe in anything like that. So up the hill he walked, and then bam, a real-life werewolf jumped out of the bushes and chased him back to town. According to the way my father told it, the werewolf had an actual dog head, but it ran like a man on its hind legs. When Bob got back to town, all his hair had turned white, and his mind had snapped. It is a fact that Bob's parents committed him, and that he never returned to our town. But I don't know for a fact that he was actually committed because of seeing a werewolf. My father's generation believed it, that's for sure. My father said that Bob told him the story to his face in early November, before the family shipped him away to the loony bin. I don't think they ever believed him, but I know that my father sure did. There came a year where in my school, the braver kids began challenging each other to go up the hill and try to trick-or-treat the old mansion. It had been over 15 years since the Bob O'Reilly incident, and most of us kinda thought the old place might be abandoned. Its reputation was still scary enough that nobody had investigated yet, but enough time had passed that it seemed inevitable that someone else would try again shortly. My friends and I decided that would be us. Although there were 7 of us who agreed to attempt the feat, 2 of them never had the guts to show up at our meeting spot on Halloween evening. So there were 5 of us, all in Halloween costumes, all ready to take our place in town history. The first people to climb the hill since Bob O'Reilly back in my father's era. And as we got to the old gate, left open permanently for as long as I could remember, 2 more of us crapped out and ran home like scaredy cats. It was true that the house was more intimidating the closer you got to it, since you'd have to crane your neck back further to even see it. Once we started climbing the path upward toward the ancient home, it became clear at once that the dirt road was far steeper than it appeared from a distance. We climbed for a minute or 2 before realizing that the house still seemed as far away as it had before. By 2 or 3 minutes into our trek, the pathway became engulfed in trees, and everything grew much darker and much colder. We could only make out the side of the old mansion above us occasionally through holes in the mostly impenetrable tree cover. Both my friends wanted to turn back, and even though I agreed with them, I talked them out of it, and we pressed on further. It was then that an immense dog the size of a bear came running out at us like something straight out of a horror movie. It ran on its hind legs, not on all 4s, and it was barking and snarling furiously at us as it ran. We all threw our bags of candy at the thing and we ran away. I didn't look back, but one of my friends told me that he did, and what he saw was that big dog down on all 4s, eating our candy, which was all over the road. None of us had our hair turn white. None of us were committed to any asylums, but we seemed to have seen what Bob O'Reilly and my father's generation called a werewolf. I thought it was a giant dog that walked upright. That's how my friends interpreted it as well. A werewolf, to me, looks more like a human than this thing did. The only thing human about what we saw was that it did walk bipedally, but it didn't walk like a man. It walked like a canine that was upright on its hind legs. There's a difference between the two. I still have family living in the house I grew up in, and we were all very curious when the mansion was sold, what new strange things would be discovered there. But nobody I'm related to has heard anything about monsters or dogs or werewolves or dogmen from the new owners or any of the local tradespeople they've been employing as they restore the old place. As we said, there have been rumors of ghost sightings and even possible poltergeist activity, which can be common when a very old residence is modernized and updated. But my family tells me that nobody ever again after me and my friends ever saw or heard anything again from the werewolf with the sweet-toothed Dogman wins, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was a kid back in the 1970s, my father had an ongoing Halloween competition with the dad next door. They both wanted to be king of the suburbs when it came to their Halloween decorations. When it came to Christmas, Dad would just string up a few lights, but when Halloween came around, we always had a huge show going on. Dad figured out how to make objects move remotely. He had zombies hidden in graves on our front lawn, and when people would walk down the block, he would watch from inside secretly. As the neighbor got to the right spot, Dad would hit a button inside, and somehow a fake zombie mannequin would pop up out of the ground and send the neighbor away screaming for their lives. Dad would always laugh so hard that his face would turn red, and he would cough for a while. that would lead to my mother lecturing him that too much happiness was the devil's playground, or something like that, and then they would argue. As soon as the fighting was done, though, Dad was back at his station, waiting for the next fly to walk into his trap. As the years went on, he developed more ways to surprise and scare people, and our home became a place people would visit on purpose at Halloween, looking to be frightened. When the next door neighbor put a zombie cemetery in his backyard and allowed strangers to come in for free to tour the graveyard, Dad lost his mind. By the next October, he had me help him build a haunted maze in the backyard that had Mom arguing with him twice daily. She was really against the entire idea, but Dad was a man obsessed. He needed to be the suburban king of Halloween. By the time I was 13, Dad's mania had led him to purchasing the property behind our house and demolishing it, thereby creating a direct path from our house to a patch of woods that was either part of the state forest or connected to a state forest. I was never really sure who owned that patch of woods, but now we owned the pathway to it. Dad fenced the place off until Halloween and labored alone like a mad scientist, not even forcing me to help him anymore. Mom grew worried, but I was so happy to not have to spend every afternoon helping my loony dad that I kept telling her Dad was perfectly okay. So when Halloween season opened that year, what was beyond Dad's fence was as much a mystery to me and the family as it was to our neighbors. What we saw was a patch of woods, kind of the same as it had always been, but Dad had a weird, subtle lighting and remains of parts of signs pointing in confusing directions and warning of things that were no longer specified. I looked with wide open eyes at what Dad had created and wished him luck. Then I turned around to leave. This was too scary looking for me, and I wanted no part of it. How had he used lights, yet made the place seem darker somehow? Even today, just thinking about that year's Halloween gives me a twinge of electric fear in my belly. So anyway, Dad didn't let me leave. He grabbed me by the arm and led me into his dark creation. He had a special job for me, he told me. We walked deeper and deeper into the woods. They seemed much larger and more dense than they ever had before. I used to take this shortcut past the old house all the time when walking to the library, but it never seemed frightening until now. It seemed like we walked a mile, and I wondered if I could figure out my way back when Dad said we had reached the spot. There was something furry on the ground, and I recoiled in horror. Dad called me rude names and told me I was acting afraid of my own costume. Costume? I looked, and sure enough, it was an Ewok costume that Dad had altered and put these big fangs into the mouth of. He told me to put the costume on, then hang out behind this bush there and wait for people to walk by. When they did, I was supposed to jump up and down and screech at them. Then they'll run away, said Dad. No, they won't, I said. They'll bop me in the nose for being a little jerk is what they'll do. Dad insisted nobody was going to bop me on the nose, then said that it wouldn't hurt as much to get bopped on the nose anyway if I was wearing the Ewok mask, so I better put it on. Then he left, and I was alone in the forest primeval, dressed as a teddy bear from space with fangs, and hoping that nobody would bop me for being dressed like this. I wondered what I should do. Disobey my dad so that I didn't get people angry at me, or obey my dad so I didn't get a spanking later. It seemed like no matter what I chose to do, I was going to be the loser in the end. That's when I heard a sound in the forest, and my initial instinct was to duck down and hide. I was too scared to be there. I really wanted to go home and watch TV. Assuming it was one of the neighbors, I figured I'd better sneak a peek at them and see if they looked like the kind who would have a good sense of humor or not. So I peeked over the bushes in the direction of the sound, but I did not see a person there at all. I saw a dog. Or maybe it was a wolf or a coyote. It was in the dark in silhouette. I could only make out its head, really. What a relief, at least it wasn't one of the neighbors. I called out to the dog, "Here, puppy." As I watched, the dog turned and saw me. I couldn't see its expression in the dark, but I saw that it was standing up. I thought it was already standing up, so this was a surprise. That dog head rose to the height of a really tall dog. Then it kept on rising higher. The dog stood up like a man, a very, very tall man. That's when I realized it must be someone else my dad had hired to scare the neighbors. I hoped. Nervously, I asked him just that. Was he working for my father? Was he part of the crew? He didn't answer. Or maybe he did, but he didn't answer in words. He answered by growling. If this was an actor, he must have been an award-winning one. I booked it out of there, running toward what I hoped was the direction of my family's house. I could hear the dog or whatever it was tearing up the forest behind me, and I never felt so terrified before. I squealed and ran, pushing past signs and knocking down a few random fake gravestones Dad had placed around. Some kind of real wild animal must have wandered in from the forest. I wasn't sure yet what was chasing me, but I knew it wasn't someone's pet, and it wasn't a person in a costume. Breaking through into my backyard screaming, I hoped someone would help me or give me a place to hide from the monster. Instead, they pointed and laughed. They thought this was part of the show. And why shouldn't they? I ran around the house and stopped around a corner trying to catch my breath. I peeked back and saw the creature in full for the first and only time. It was standing twice as tall as the men, looking down and sort of half screaming and half barking at everyone. It snapped at them and they pulled away, laughing the entire time. They must have thought it was some sort of trick. It didn't look real, and yet there was nothing else it could be. It had the head of a crazed wolf with pointed ears and darker fur than I'd ever seen on wolves before. Despite the dog head, it had the body of a kind of a Sasquatch-looking creature. Or maybe like a dark bear, but it moved much more quickly than a bear and seemed much more used to being on its hind legs than a bear would be. The way it ran wasn't like a dog or a bear or an ape or a human exactly. It just sort of ran like a monster. I decided to try to sneak into the house and hide in the confusion when someone grabbed me from behind, holding their hand over my mouth. I struggled and I kicked hard, which caused a very familiar voice to tell me to cut it out. Looking upward, I saw that it was my father. He snuck me quietly into the house, and we watched from the kitchen window as the dog man crashed into the woods and disappeared. The crowd applauded as though this were a scheduled performance. My father told me to throw out the Ewok costume and never speak of this again. He then proceeded to go outside and lie to all the neighbors that they had just witnessed an actual werewolf chasing an actual juvenile Sasquatch across his property. Needless to say, he won the Halloween Wars for that year. Or maybe I should say, Dogman won. The Dogman of Austin, Texas. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. This story actually took place in Mayfield Park, which is a nature preserve. I remembered it being in Austin, but it looks like it might actually be in nearby Tarrytown according to this map I'm looking at. Either way, this story took place when I used to live in Austin in the early part of the 21st century. Now, Austin has a reputation of being weird, and everyone there is very proud of it. But nobody that I ever met the entire time I stayed over there was ever as weird as the Dogman. So like I said, one day I went to Mayfield Park, brought there by a girl who had lived in Austin longer than I had. She wanted to show me her secret place in the park where she liked to sit. She told me she always wished she could sit there with someone else, so I got elected for the gig. When we finally found the area she liked so much, it was not what I was expecting. The area seemed to be built on the edge of a cliff, and there were stone walls to keep you from walking off the edge. The view was remarkable, but that wasn't what she brought me here to see. We walked a few feet away from the wall overlooking the forest far below, and found a bench facing away from the magnificent view. Why would they have built and stationed this bench facing in that direction? There was just a bunch of trees over there. Still, this is where the girl wanted to sit, so I sat with her and then stared at a bunch of trees for a while. She asked me if I didn't love it, and I said I couldn't argue that I didn't. After a while, something shifted. I mean, it felt like everything changed somehow. Maybe the atmosphere changed or the ions in the air became different. It felt like everything suddenly was vibrating at a different frequency, like as though there were a sound present now that wasn't there before. The air tasted differently, and everything felt electric. I smelled matches and tasted metal. "Do you feel it?" the girl asked me, and I could see her hair rising around her face. It was floating in the air and rising higher all the time. What was happening? Were we about to get hit by lightning? We both heard a sound from the trees, and immediately both our views were drawn to the small forest in front of us. There, we saw two immense hands reach out and part a couple of medium-sized trees. The hands looked like they were 6 feet off the ground, and the strength they were demonstrating was superhuman in my estimation. Suddenly horrified, I remember backing up on the bench so I was now sitting up on the back of it higher than the girl. Why I didn't run, I'm not sure. I guess I just wanted to see what was going to walk out of those trees. I'm not sure I really should have stayed. I think it might have been a better thing if I never saw what was in those woods, because it wasn't something that made sense either then or now. It wasn't something that could have been there, and yet it was there. My brain and mind are disconnected from each other ever since then. I don't trust my own eyes anymore, even when I'm with someone else who is seeing exactly the same thing. My entire world got turned on its head in that next moment, because when those trees parted, this thing walked out that looked like some kind of demonic, hairy, dog-headed monster. It was angry before it had a reason to be. Then it saw us, and it got angrier. That was my impression of it, that it was nothing but a manifestation of savagery itself. I should have looked away. I should have run. I should have done anything but continue to sit there in the presence of this foul and unholy beast. This was not something that belonged in our world. This was not something it was healthy to be near. So why was I not running? Why was I not walking away? Why was I not at least looking away from it? The girl was saying something, and I realized that the air was so charged, it was hard to make out words from her speech. This was almost like an altered state of consciousness, yet it was affecting us both at the same time. I focused on her lips, and it seemed that she was saying, "This isn't the place we really are. We aren't actually seeing this from here." "Where are we seeing this from?" I asked, and the monster screeched in pain and horror. I was hurting it physically by asking questions about it. Nothing was making any sense, and the next thing I remember is waking up the next morning, feeling like I had the worst hangover of my life. I never saw that girl again, so I never got her side of the story. I was told that she moved out with no advance warning, but she had left money to cover her share of the rent, so nobody even bothered her about it. I guess this all happened while I was asleep. Nobody had any info about how I ended up back in my own bed. They looked at me strangely for even asking the question. I guess they all assumed I had a psychedelic experience of some kind. And actually, I guess that most likely they were correct, at least in some way. What is the strange power that the Dogman has over human consciousness? Is it a real thing that actually looks like a werewolf? Or is it something or someone else that only makes us think that it looks like a dog-headed, hairy man monster? Maybe the Dogman isn't just a beast. Maybe the Dogman is some kind of life form far more sophisticated than human beings. Maybe Dogman is a bit too much for us to even understand.
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night,
and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.